I'm going to talk to you for the next few minutes about writing tips and the importance of story, style, and sales pitch. So I thought I'd start, given that we're talking about writing, to give you some tips from the top. So great authors and what they've said about writing and how we might apply that to grant applications. And I think the first one to start with is Ernest Hemingway. And I think the message behind that is you don't want to be submitting the first draft of your application to the funding panel. It goes through many iterations and many improvements before it's ready to go. So don't submit it if it isn't really in tip-top condition. One day I will find the right words and they will be simple. I think we've already had quite a vibe here. So this is a quote from Jack Kerouac, but we've had quite a vibe from our panelists about the importance of simple language where possible, accepting that we do have to use technical language sometimes, but simple language to convey as quickly and clearly as possible to a reader what is going on in your application. The first sentence of a book is a handshake, perhaps an embrace. So Jhumpa Lahiri here. And again, you've heard about the importance of the summaries, the plain English summary, how if you can engage the reader at that early stage of the application, you will then draw them in to the rest of the application with a smile on their faces rather than with a dreaded anticipation about what they might find later on. But for my own part, if a book is well written, I always find it too short. So again, this is from Jane Austen. It's about engaging your reader, keeping them engaged, actually interesting your reader. And if you interest them, they will read your application with joy. So that's something to bear in mind. Fill your paper with the breathings of your heart. Now, this sounds far too romantic, really, to be using in grant applications, but there's a little buzz, a little element of this in particular in fellowship applications, because it's about you, it's about your career, it's about your interests and your passions. So in fellowship applications in particular, getting, not necessarily saying, I'm passionate about this, but conveying by what you've done, by the way you write, that this is something you are very interested in. And your heart is set on it, can be quite engaging for reviewers, particularly for fellowships. I can write with authority only about what I know well. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Now, of course, if we're going to embark upon a research project and it's a new area or something that we don't know, you can argue, well, how can we possibly know about it? But I think this is the difference between saying, I've spent my whole life working as, a laboratory technician, and I'm going to do a research project relating to hands-on nursing care on the ward. Basically, when you put an application in, your previous experience will be relevant to it. You may have already undertaken research in an adjacent or similar field. You're not going to dive into a new area that you know nothing about and have no training in. You can't rush inspiration. So again, I suppose a message about pacing yourself, taking time, making sure that you're thinking through everything properly and carefully before you put it down on paper and send it off. Importantly here, don't be crushed by other people's gatekeeping. That said, take a good look at your work and make sure it is publishable and is going to stand out. So this is a quote from Bernardine Evaristo. I think in academe and in clinical academic environment, you have to get used to the notion of rejection. You have to get used to the notion of people criticizing your work. Obviously, it's up to those who are doing that to do it in a professional and relatively compassionate way, but it doesn't always happen. So we have to be prepared for a bit of, reviewers sometimes can be a bit to the point. I've heard people say, it's very upsetting. And of course it is. And we all get a lot of rejections. And I always think it's a bit like being an actor. You go to lots of auditions, and even though you're perfectly capable some of the time to play the part, you're just not going to get it because there's too much competition. And when you look at the feedback that you get, sometimes it can make you cross and angry, and it can be upsetting. But I think you do have to look critically at what has been said. You may say, oh, they haven't understood, or, they didn't get the point. In which case, was it something about your writing that led them down that alleyway, even if it was a misunderstanding? So do take on board what reviewers say and then rework any future applications to take those things on board and try hard not to lose heart. I think, don't quote me, but I have heard that, studies have been done on what makes a successful researcher, and it's invariably those who persist in putting in applications. If you're easily crushed, you're not going to be putting future applications in. So those who persist, who say, "Oh well, I'll try another funding stream, or I'll rework it, I'll take on board what they said and resubmit," are the people who are ultimately going to survive in an academic or clinical academic environment. So don't be crushed. I remember hearing a talk from somebody who is a great mentor for people, and she just basically said, "I give people 24 hours to get angry. I give them 24 hours and then I expect them to get on with the next grant application." So just bear that in mind. It's part and parcel of academic life. And finally, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by. It's a great quote from Douglas Adams. Now, this can work in two different ways. These deadlines exist to help you get your application in on time, so you might want to make sure you don't miss it. But on the other hand, if it's looming and the application isn't really ready, most funding schemes have regular calls. If it's not urgent to get it in at that call, you can wait and make it better and then submit it. So just something to think about. I'll just flag again that parts of this presentation have been drawn from ideas in the Research Funding Toolkit. And just to remind you of the 4 key propositions there: the importance proposition, the success proposition, the value proposition, and the competence proposition. So I think we've already gathered some of the challenges that we have with writing grant applications. We have rigid templates, those pesky page limits and word counts that floor us all and mean that we leave out bits and pieces that reviewers then say, "Why haven't you told us this?" The most frustrating thing. Getting the right information in the right place. Sometimes when you have slightly ambiguous headings and you think, "Oh, where shall I put what?" We've heard the challenges about funding panels and reviewers, the fact that you're trying to cater in your writing, not only for specialists who may be your external peer reviewers, but non-specialists such as lay members of panels, and those who, maybe methodologists who don't know your subject area. The fact you're catering for detailed readers, statisticians and health economists who are going to dive into specific sections of your application, and you're catering for speed readers who need to pick up the gist and the quality of your application just by skimming through what they're reading. So what they need are clear pointers, relevant information, no waffle, good arguments that appeal to the funder, so not necessarily to a discipline. These are things that are to do with the funder's remit, and sufficient detail to assess quality and feasibility. And getting that balance right is not easy. And we all have tremendous sympathy with people putting in grant applications, and I'm sure that funding panel members do too. The first thing I want to talk about is the overall sort of structure and symmetry of grant applications. And I have sort of talked about this already, but by structure, we've got some good definitions here: the existing arrangement and mutual relation of the constituent parts of the material object, or symmetry, due and just proportion, harmony of parts with each other in the whole, fitting, regular or balanced arrangement and relation of parts or elements. So we're talking about how everything fits together. So thinking again of that aeroplane, each has a role to play, and it comes together in this sensible object. But this idea of symmetry, different parts of the application reflecting other parts of the application, to maintain a narrative using similar words, etc. And as I said earlier, I think aims and objectives are at the heart of this, and your aims and objectives will influence the title, they'll influence the plain English summary, the scientific abstract. The background and rationale will support those aims and objectives. The research plan will be addressing those aims and objectives. The outputs and impact will reflect the objectives. The project expertise you require will obviously relate to the area that you're covering. If you're doing a fellowship, the training that you'll do will relate to the things that you're doing in the method section. The patient and public involvement, those with lived experience who are helping with the study, will reflect those aims and objectives, and the budget will obviously reflect those objectives. So at the heart of your grant application are the aims and objectives, and we should see them mirrored in all the other bits of your application. So that's symmetry. We're now moving on to story, which is extremely important. So as I say, it's quite easy to say, well, I've got brilliant design, it's brilliant, I've got everything in place. But if the rationale behind your project does not stand up, people, it won't matter how good your research design is. Now, sometimes if you're responding to a commission call, in a sense, someone has already said there's an evidence gap, but you still need to create your own story. But if you're not responding to a commissioned call, it's up to you to convince the reviewer that this is an important area. And yes, they may get subject experts in to confirm that, but not always. And so it is up to you to demonstrate the need for the project. And there are a number of places where that's going to happen in your grant application. Firstly, the background and rationale is probably the most comprehensive place where you'll put your story, but it should be there in the plain English summary and the scientific summary for people to pick up the urgency and importance of your work early on. In terms of your tools for writing your story, the first is obviously the literature, so prior systematic or other reviews that have been done that show or demonstrate evidence gaps. Other primary research papers, which will also show what's been done and what remains to be done. And there may be other bits and pieces, for example, grey literature, what your patient and public involvement group have said, that can also inform what you're trying to convey. Prior work that you have undertaken as a team is tremendously useful too. So pilot and feasibility work, which shows the viability of your work, and also shows that previously it has been considered an evidence gap, because if you got that work funded, clearly it was something that people saw was valuable. And then finally, we have the presentation of those arguments. The style in which you write, the language, the argument, and the coherence are all very important. And a lot of this presentation is about the style of your writing and how you can convey importance, etc., in a straightforward and clear manner. So if we think about what the story again, well, what's the argument? And that's what we're looking for in this background section, an argument. What you see if you look at numerous research applications, whether they're drafts or actual applications, is a very similar format. So, for example, something is a problem and you're giving evidence for it, whether that's the prevalence or incidence, poor patient outcomes, costs, etc. Its resolution would improve many things. So we would see reduction in prevalence or incidence, better patient outcomes, reduced costs. Previous work has shown X, Y, and Z, but this is deficient in the following ways. So you're defining what the knowledge gap is. This project will address the knowledge gap. And if we resolve the uncertainty, and it will provide necessary information or solution to the problem. And when the project is done, the problem will be resolved, and the impact of this will be, A, B, and C. So this is a very formulaic way of looking at a background section, but it's often what you will see. And you can go and have a look, in fact, at a few drafts or even, academic papers, and you'll see similar sorts of arguments. So just to make that point strongly, I'm going to give you a daft example. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, this is a study to evaluate the impact of Jedi Force staff training on the mortality and morbidity associated with dark side. And in true academic tradition, I'll give it a daft acronym. So the dark side is a problem. It causes death in large numbers of people every year and has been even shown to exterminate whole planetary populations. In addition, it causes much anxiety and depression. The costs are enormous, both for victims, but also in rebuilding lives and civilizations affected. Removal of the dark side would be beneficial to many millions of people. It would reduce suffering and death and reduce costs to the NHS and other health and social welfare organisations. Current approaches to remove the dark side, such as attacks by small numbers of disorganized rebels, have failed. There is a clear need for a more radical and magical solution. Preliminary studies indicate the potential of force training for Jedi Knights in tackling the dark side, but its full efficacy and effectiveness is unknown. This project will evaluate whether or not force training of Jedi Knights is effective in fighting the dark side. If this approach is found to be beneficial, the dark side may be successfully defeated with resulting improvements in quality of life and longevity throughout the galaxy. Now, we would say that until I think another Jedi Knight goes AWOL, because frankly, they're completely unreliable. More seriously, we can apply that argument, as you can see, almost anywhere. We've got a couple of examples here where it's been applied. This is a typical sort of feasibility study, which I know a lot of people do as part of their fellowships and research for patient benefit applications. But this is an example of an RFPB, quite an ancient one now. But this is the argument they made. Obesity has led to more type 2 diabetes, which causes morbidity and premature mortality. It costs the NHS a great deal. So they're basically saying obesity is a problem in this group. Reduction in obesity in those with obesity and type 2 diabetes would reduce complications, even resolve the diabetes. So its resolution would improve many things. It then goes on to describe what the current guidance is for those with non-morbid obesity. So this is for people within one particular BMI bracket and the sorts of things that are suggested, exercise, behavioural changes, but pointing out that the literature shows that these have limited effects, that preliminary studies have shown the potential for bariatric surgery for those in this particular group. And results need confirming for this in a larger trial. But actually, at the moment, we don't know whether trial is feasible. Obviously, surgery is quite a major intervention, and we need to know how everyone feels about it. So basically, previous work has shown we need better interventions, that bariatric surgery is a possibility, and we need a trial, but we don't know whether trial is feasible. A feasibility study will enable us to see if bariatric surgery is logistic possible and acceptable to a group of patients and their clinicians. So this project will show whether or not a trial is feasible. And if this is successful and a definitive study shows it works, this could be a cost-effective solution for this group. Obviously, it's early stage at this point. So if a trial and it's possible, it's undertaken and it works, we will have a solution. Doesn't always have to be an intervention. So this is more of a descriptive study trying to find out something we don't know. So we have here currently inpatient care for children and young people with severe mental problems is variable, and they often end up on adult wards, which is unsatisfactory. So, we've got a problem with children with severe mental illnesses. Improvements in care would lead to better patient outcomes and resource use. So a resolution to this problem would be a good thing, both for the patients and for the NHS. Currently, we don't know how patients fare or whether different settings affect patients' progress and the cost implications of these different settings. So there's little prior work, basically, on these things. This project will provide information on these things. So this project will give us the information we need, and then this information will be vital to those responsible for ensuring that young people have access to high quality inpatient care. It'll also help staff in local services to make better use of their beds. So this study will provide much needed information to plan better services. So, these 5 bullet points can create a meaningful and powerful argument for what it is that you're doing. The things that I've mentioned there are what we call convincing arguments. So they're the things that you want reviewers to remember. There's another set of things you can pop into your story, which are defensive arguments or defensive sort of response to the niggles and bubbles that will come up in a reviewer's head. So it deals with those problems up front. So we're not trying to conceal the issues and problems we may have with research design. We know that nothing's perfect, but we're being upfront with the limitations. So for example, if you're only collecting data from a couple of counties, in fact, if you show that data from the ONS shows a socio-demographic profile to be very similar to national averages, you can then say the results from this study should therefore be generalizable to the broader UK population. So a reviewer may read, oh, look, they're only doing a survey in a couple of counties. That's not going to be generalizable. And there'll be a little alarm bell, a little red flag. In the next sentence, you allay that fear by telling them, actually, they're pretty representative of the general population. In writing a story, it's helpful to add emphases and refine your argument. So make good use of connectives. So as well as, despite this, in contrast, therefore, remarkably, in conclusion, accordingly, it appears, however, the fact is, all these linking sentences can be very helpful in constructing a convincing argument. And do pack a punch. So use the literature to define the problem, to justify why you're doing the piece of work, where there's any kind of, question over the design. You might actually want to even add something about the design. If people expect to see an RCT, but you're not doing one, there'll be other reasons for doing that. That might be something you put either in the background, or you might put it in the method section. There's still a story going on there. It shows the work fits the remit, and it gives you a logical, convincing argument. So pack a punch in that background section, or wherever you're writing and wanting to make a point. By the end of a background section, you want reviewers to be asking themselves, why haven't we done this before? We really should fund this. Obviously, it's a problem fitting it on the form. And now the NIHR used to stipulate that you needed these three headings. The first, what is the problem being addressed? Then why is it important? And review of existing evidence. Some people don't like those headings, and in fact, they've relented a bit. They don't insist upon those headings, but they do make the suggestion that you use these kinds of descriptions or way of organizing the information that you want to present. So firstly, you're setting the scene. What is the problem being addressed? You're defining the problem and its impact. You're saying how it will fill a gap. NIHR in particular want you to make a comment on inequalities and underserved populations. That's specific to them as a funder. And they want a clear indication of how the research fits the funding remit. You can then go on to say why the research is important, its importance for patients, service users, the public, to the NHS, social care services, or public health. You can quote policies and directives, some of the ones that Lisa was mentioning, the James Lind Alliance, or whether professional bodies or NICE evidence, they've come up and said, well, we want these things looked at. So you can quote all those, and you can say what your anticipated outcomes and impact will be, bearing in mind, especially those who are currently very much affected by the condition or situation that you're describing. And then you can have a review of the existing evidence. So you're using what's published out there already to say, what you're doing is plugging a gap. It justifies the work. Usually there should be some systematic review. Now, it does depend on the funding scheme that you're going for. So there will be possibly existing systematic reviews out there. If there aren't, you would probably want to think about doing one, which obviously is quite a major job. However, other forms of literature review may be satisfactory, especially, for example, for a doctoral fellowship, where you could actually, as long as you've got the primary data, the primary literature quoted in your background section, perhaps with the help of your supervisors or a scoping review, you can then undertake a systematic review as a dedicated work package. In other funding schemes, I think they would expect you to clearly demonstrate that the work, prior research has been looked at systematically in some way. Otherwise, they will worry that you're not plugging an evidence gap, or it might be something that's been done by somebody else. And importantly, prior work of the team, so pilot or feasibility work that you may have done. Obviously, you may not have done that, but if you have, put it there. So when you're considering the story, remember, use the force of argument. So let's move on to style. So writing style. Keep it easy to read. And I think, again, you've already got the vibe from earlier discussions that simplicity is what people are looking for. Clarity is what people are looking for. Bernard is going to talk a little bit later about sort of plain English. So I'm going to sort of supplement what he's saying. So use headline messages. Don't use convoluted arguments. State, what the problems are clearly. Use adjectives sparingly, so they slow the reader down. They can be used for factual qualification, and avoid, things like passion, exciting, profound. Let the reader feel it and see it in what you're presenting, not read it as a word. And use adverbs even more sparingly. I think we'll stop for a literary interlude here. May in Amenemen is a hot brooding month. The days are long and humid. The river shrinks and black crows gorge on bright mangoes in still dusk green trees. Red bananas ripen, jackfruits burst, dissolute bluebottles hum vacuously in the fruity air. Then they stun themselves against clear window panes and die, fatly baffled in the sun. Well, what a wonderful paragraph of prose from a literary novel by Arundhati Roy. Of course, we want none of that, I'm afraid, in a research grant application. Do not use typography to emphasize too much text. If it's important, put it at the beginning of the paragraph, and we'll say more about that in a minute. But it can be very baffling, especially to speed readers, if you've got these chunks of bold and emboldened text in the middle of a paragraph. So do be careful in the use of those kinds of emphases. If it's important, put it up front in the paragraph. You can use bullet numbers, bullet points and numbered lists. Sometimes that helps with word counts as well. Short paragraphs, short sentences, simple punctuation. If you find yourself using colons or semicolons, put a full stop and a capital letter instead. So another literary interlude, and I'm going to take a deep breath here. In consideration of the day and hour of my birth, it was declared by the nurse and by some sage women in the neighbourhood who had taken a lively interest in me several months before there was any possibility of us becoming personally acquainted. First, that I was destined to be unlucky in life, and secondly, that I was privileged to see ghosts and spirits, both of these gifts inevitably attaching, as they believe, to all unlucky infants of either gender born towards the small hours of a Friday night. Whew, well, that is one paragraph, but it's also one sentence. But it's indeed the first paragraph, indeed the first sentence of David Copperfield. But yeah, all great books that use you can use a lack of sentences. In fact, I think, is it Bernardine Evaristo's book? She's got no full stops at all. um, anyway, so what about this? Mia groaned. She hated that word. Learning was the thing her mother valued above all else, but to Mia, learning was just boring. It's Gwyneth Reese's Cosmo and the Magic Sneeze, one of my daughter's favourite books from her childhood. And I think the message I'm trying to give you here is that if you're going to write a grant application, think children's books rather than literary novels. So keeping with making it easy to read, it's important to have breathing space in the text. Obviously, again, very difficult. When you've got word counts and you think, oh God, I've got to stuff as many words in as possible. But, from a reviewer's point of view, reading crushed 10-point page after page with no, single spacing is soul destroying. And most funders will ask you to stick to particular font sizes and etc. But having breathing space and indeed using subheadings, even if they're your own, some funders will ask for specific subheadings, but unless they say you can't, it is possible to put some subheadings within those subheadings to guide the reader sometimes. So, for example, and this is just an example of a real application that went in, but we've fiddled with it, obviously, to make a point. This is not as easy to read and is rather intimidating. If you put in a few spaces, it immediately looks more manageable. And if you put in some very helpful headings that guide the reader, then it's even more appealing to a reviewer on, beginning to read it. You've already heard the importance of avoiding new or specialist acronyms. Sometimes they are unavoidable because we work in technical areas, some of us. But if we do use them, then they need to be defined clearly the first time they're used, and they need to be defined clearly in each section that you use them, because there's nothing worse getting at page 72 of a grant application thinking, oh God, here's an acronym. I can't remember it. I think it was defined somewhere around page 29, but I really can't be bothered to find it. So do remember to repeat those definitions if you've got a particularly long grant application, because not everyone reads every section. So there's just an example of what we might call alphabet soup. Limit the use of overly technical language, jargons, and buzzwords. Again, it's not always possible to avoid these things, but if you are going to use technical language, again, you have to explain it. And I have seen some very technical, say, lab-based grant applications. You can even handle situations like that by, for example, having a brief lay sentence at the beginning to give the person the gist of what it's about, and really highlighting to any expert reader that this is the place where they dive in and where a speed reader will skip. So if you then do have to talk about or use complex language, then make sure that it is defined as best you can, so that people don't, if they do decide to read it, don't get too upset. But you can guide the different types of readers around your grant application. But if you do have to use it, define it, and please use as simple language as possible. Be consistent, and I think we've talked about this in relation to objectives fitting the method section. So between sections, a common error I like to think of as a meandering objectives. I have geography in my history, and I like this sort of NASA view of a river. We all know that when rivers flow across the land, they wriggle and they form meanders, and if they wriggle very widely, they cut off entirely and become oxbolates and take on a new meaning all of their own. And that is a risk with applications if we are using slightly different language, for example, in our title, in our objectives, in our work package headings, that we end up addressing in the method something we haven't even proposed in the objectives. So be very consistent in your use of terminology between sections, and that will help you keep on target with what you're trying to do. And be consistent also in your use of terms. So if you're using directorate in one place, don't use unit or ward in another. And if you're talking about, for example, obesity, make sure it's defined, and then don't use the term overweight later on, because that will confuse people. So precision and pandering, I suppose, to pedants, as Izzy suggested earlier on, is important, because reviewers will be picky. But it is easy to confuse them. This is another literary interlude to show the importance of consistency. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Aina, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. It's the Silmarillion. Another book that my daughter said, oh, you must read this, but I realized you do need a family tree, a map, and a glossary really to understand it, because there are lots of different sorts of people, and these different sorts of people have different names for each other. So everyone has about 3 different names, which mean the same thing, and it actually becomes exceedingly difficult to understand. So, you get to the stage, Melkor or Morgoth, I just don't know. So it does show that consistency is far easier to understand. Be logical, another important part of style. So logical arguments, I'm sure you're all familiar with that Escher picture, but we're looking for a logical flow of sentence, paragraphs and sections, and we don't want you to contradict yourself. So a little literary interlude to demonstrate that. Avoid spelling mistakes and poor grammar. If you know it's something that you struggle with, then you can use the various tools that are available, and you can get people to help read through your application and pick through these. Although it's a pain to think that your application will be judged or punished as a result of these sorts of things, it adds to the complexity of reading if the grammar is not right, or if there's spelling mistakes. And it can be very, very irritating to the pedants among the reviewers who'll be looking at your application, which can just basically make them poorly disposed towards your application. You can repeat key messages, and I know in a world where word counts are a real pain, you may be reluctant to do that, but as I've already mentioned, not everybody reads every section. So if there's something very important that you want to get across, then it's worth repeating it. So this is an example of the various sections in one it's actually an NIHR Career Development Fellow from quite a long time ago, but she talks about extensive prior work, preliminary results has already shown things, again, extensive prior work, existing system prototype, extensive prior work, first prototypes development, existing diagnostic system prototype. All of these are playing into the success criterion. There's lots of prior work. We're just about to launch into the next stage of something that's already got so far along the path. It's going to make reviewers feel, oh yeah, this is going somewhere. Keep it memorable. I believe, I'm told there's some sort of magic number 7. People can't remember more than about 7 bullet points or 7 things in a row. So do help reviewers by sort of chunking relevant information together so that they can remember them. Keep it formal, so avoid abbreviations that we might use in informal writing, like will or shan't. Avoid informalities and over-personalization. So I and we totally accept in grant applications and academic writing today, but not I am not convinced. Really, you need to let the literature speak for itself. And colloquialisms, colloquialisms, metaphors, etc., are all helpful actually for the plain English summary. So. Now, there are a number of helpful writing techniques that I think it's worth pointing out. I'll mention to you first assert justify, because it's one of my favorites. Where I said don't, use typography to highlight important points, put it at the beginning of the sentence. That is what we call assert justify. I think in academic writing, we tend to build up to the most important point and we bung it at the end of the paragraph when nobody will see it and certainly a speed reader will miss it. If there's something important that you want to make clear, put it at the beginning of the paragraph. It's a very simple, direct way to communicate. And it's actually very helpful because you can then lift out these assertions for summaries. So things like this area of work is under research, current therapists do not address this area, previous work is limited and lacks methodological rigor. This program of work will address prior deficiencies, etc. So you're getting important points across in the first sentence. So another literary interlude. I'm sure that all of you will recognise this wonderful assert justify, the first sentence of a very famous novel. And we got another one here. I don't know if any of you recognise this one. So so assert justify. Ask yourself if a speed reading reviewer reads only the first sentence of each paragraph, will they get the message? And I've got a great example here of what in the old days was the expertise and experience section, a bit like the narrative CV actually we have today for a CDF. And we can see what this particular applicant put in her first sentences. Well, firstly, she talks about her career, but actually what she's saying there is, I already have a career. She talks about her qualifications. I am well qualified. She talks about her supervisors encouraging her to become independent. I am an independent researcher. She starts the paragraph with my results have been published in various journals. I have a good research track record is the message she's sending us. I've already successfully supervised people. I'm already involved in research capacity development. She talks about setting up a conference with colleagues internationally. I have international collaborators in this novel field. She talks about her preliminary results showing feasibility and potential impact. This project is likely to succeed. So this is the interpretation of each of those initial sentences she had at the beginning of each paragraph. If we look at the assessment criteria, which you can't nowadays because it's for the old CDF, it absolutely hits on the head each one of those assessment criteria. So she's beginning the sentence dealing with the assessment criteria. So any reviewer with a checkbox of the assessment criteria will see that she's hit each of those criteria just by reading the first sentence in each paragraph that she's written in that section. This is another example of a paragraph that was actually in a successful application. I don't know if you just want to look at it for a couple of seconds and think, have they really started the paragraph with the most important sentence? So I'll just give you a couple of seconds for that. So in fact, this is a much better sentence to start your paragraph with. Current early warning scores do not perform well at identifying patients at increased risk of in-hospital death due to numerous deficiencies in the methods used to develop them. You then go on to talk about the conclusions of a systematic, these were the conclusions of a systematic review. It's not really important that a systematic review has been published. It's useful to know, but it's not getting across one of your main argument points. So think carefully about the positioning of sentences in paragraphs. Priming is another helpful writing technique. This basically gives readers advanced information that will make the reader more likely to agree to your proposition. If you're driving down a motorway and you see one of these signs, you can betcha that within a couple of miles you will see a sign for motorway services. It's softening you up for what you're going to see next and encouraging you to take advantage of a cup of coffee if you need it. So, for example, saying each year 30,000 people suffer from something is priming for work on it. If there's a dearth of evidence concerning something, it's priming for work. Data will be gathered using something, priming for a later resource request. Previous relevant work by a co-applicant, again, priming the choice of personnel for the study detailed later. Signposting, and I've already talked a little bit about signposting. It tells the reader important information is coming. It helps to structure and highlight arguments. It allows speed readers to skip or take note. It ensures detailed readers and take note sections that they have to take note. And also, you can refer to other sections, see other section, blah, for more details. So this is a really helpful technique to be aware of. So in this section, we describe, or we now set out the state of the art, or the following work packages will answer these questions. If you're a speed reader, you may not dive into the detail, you'll skip on to the next paragraph. But if you're a detailed reader and it's all about the statistical methodology, you're going to dive in and you're going to read it. So it just allows people to read what they want, but it is also very helpful in structuring the application. Linking. So again, we've already encountered linking in some of the examples that you've seen. So it connects arguments and maintains the narrative. It allows the reader to see the logic of what you're doing. And it can help sometimes when you've got very bitty templates, if you can link things together. So whilst this previous work has shown encouraging results, there are only 2 studies that have looked specifically at this issue, and then you detail them. This work has answered one aspect of this question. However, there remains the issue of, this intervention has been shown in several studies to work in the acute phase. Furthermore, early evidence suggests that it may also benefit patients in the chronic stage. So again, it's using those connectives in a powerful way to maintain the narrative and to create really good arguments in what you're writing. If we take this plain English summary, we can see some fantastic examples of linking there. However, in addition, yet finally and importantly, there's this thing called tag phrases and labeling. This is where you are using quite a technical term, which we often have to. It may be the subject, for example, of the proposal that you're putting in. But as a reader, if you can pick up early on the meaning of the particular words that you want people to understand, you then take them to heart and you can start throwing them around yourself because you actually understand them. So if you do have to use slightly more specialist terms, make sure they're very clearly defined, that they run through the document, that they're used identically and in repeated phrases to label these themes. And it helps, as I say, the reader to feel that they understand what's going on. So in this particular application, the use of the term systematic review and early warning scores were used repeatedly, never in any other way, so that reviewers could pick up exactly on what they mean and then feel perfectly comfortable reading them in the future. Okay, well, I thought it might be interesting just to sort of towards the end of this presentation talk about sales pitch. And I actually looked up to see what salesmen are told to do when they meet with clients. And I thought that we might learn something from them and sort of translate that into research application writing terms. So the first thing they are told is to know your customer. And actually, we do that with grant applications. So we need to know the scope and the remit of the funder. We need to follow the guidance notes that they've laid out, and we need to respond carefully to commission calls. So we are responding and knowing what the customer wants. If we get that wrong, we may find we're submitting an application that's out of remit. Know your product. So they're asked to know your product. Well, again, we need to know what we're offering the funder. So we need to be on top of the literature, and we need to know where what we are doing fits in with the picture that's out there already and how we're adding to that picture. So that's all about, knowing what you're doing and that it fits into the literature and that it answers the evidence gap. Acknowledge the problems with existing products. And again, this is to do with being on top of the literature and knowing the evidence gaps. Because it's something that you have to do. You can also apply it. I think actually, I think that will come later. So offer a solution to a problem. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're producing an intervention or a study which addresses the problem and the limitations of previous interventions or studies. Say why your product is better than others. So know the limitations of other studies and interventions. Produce an intervention that addresses these problems. Hook your customer. So have a fantastic title and a fantastic plain English summary. Make a good first impression. So no typos in the title. Have an immediately obvious great team, a good title, and a great plain English summary. Tell a story. So have logically argued background and rationale. address objections up front. This is the other thing I was referring to. So this is being upfront about the limitations of your approach, because we know that every research design has its limitations, but provide mitigation where possible. So those defensive arguments that I was talking about earlier. Differentiate yourself, so have a great team and have an original idea or project. Listen and respond to the customer. So respond to reviewers' comments, or for round 2 or your next attempt or at interview, respond carefully to those and make sure you're addressing any questions or issues that have been raised. Dazzle them. So have a great team, an original idea or project, and basically a fantastic grant proposal. I think as academics and clinical academics and people working in social care and public health, we're perhaps a bit Mr. Spocky. You know, we tend to be want to be very measured and dot all our I's and cross all our T's. And we do have to do that in grant applications, but you do need, as I say, especially in fellowship applications, that undercurrent of excitement, of passion, that this is something that's new, that could really help people. So we need to try and engage with our inner Jim Kirk, despite our Mr. Spock tendencies. And finally, give yourself time to do a good job. Include everything that's requested. Get pre-submission reviews from inside and outside your specialty. From inside your specialty, your expert reviewers will pick up on all the technical bits and pieces that you've got wrong and all the literature that you may not have picked up on. But you need to get reviewers from outside your specialty area, so people like the Research Support Service or colleagues working in a different area, who will understand, broadly speaking, science, but they're not going to know your specific area. And it's also important to get some lay people to read your application as well, because there'll be important things that you want them to walk away with and to understand from the application. So checking your plain English summary, you know, even looking through other parts of your grant application so that they're on board throughout if they were to read it. And remember, keep tweaking, adjusting and redrafting until your application is a thing of beauty. And we can see the likes of Leonardo here has obviously spent many hours fiddling with his concept before he produces a marvelous cartoon.